Do me a favor, watch this clip.
Like a big thing is the resurrection, right? People say, really? He resurrected from the dead? Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, everybody agreed, haters, Romans, and the Jewish people, everybody agreed he died. That's 100%. That's why when they stab him and you say water came out, it wasn't water, it was fluid from his lungs because he was dead. And that's what would happen to you or I when we die, is we have this lung fluid that comes out. So that's what they said, oh, that's water. And that's what they made him divinity. But it was like a natural thing. He's dead. Everyone agrees. And you say, well, they buried him in a tomb. And then the next day or 3 days later, the tomb's empty. And people are like, so, you know, that made up. And they say 500 people saw him in the town. Romans and Hebrew, they saw him over the next couple of weeks. 500 independently sourced people, real, like corroborated, 500 people saw him. Mm-hmm. So you say, okay, so there's that. And then the other conspiracy theory is like, well, the disciples robbed his body. The disciples just robbed his body because they didn't want him. They would hand over crucifixion victims to like the wild dogs. That used to be the way it was. If you got crucified, throw you in a pit, wild dogs eat you, or leave you on the cross, birds will eat you. That's how we deal with you. So they're like, that's why they were taking his body. And then you see that, well, that's probably not what happened. And the Romans themselves acknowledge there's no body in that tomb that we put in there 3 days ago. The body is not there and we did it. So in order to save ourselves, we're going to say the apostles robbed it. But in reality, that's just a conspiracy because the apostles would have no reason to rob it.
So the Romans think the apostles robbed the body.
That's a conspiracy.
Why do you say conspiracy? Well, you're saying a conspiracy to diminish the story.
No. I meant conspiracy in the sense of that's what people say as a reason why the.
Did the Romans say that?
The Romans have said that. The Romans said that back then, and then I guess conspiracy is the wrong word because I'm not. Like it's one story, one explanation. I'll say explanation of.
But if you looked at it, like, what's the most logical explanation? Is the most logical explanation that a dead guy came back to life? Or the most logical explanation that someone took his body, because that's what the Romans said?
I'm saying that
he came back to life
one time. And I'm not saying I'm crazy about it. I'm just saying, you know what? After reading that book, there was enough things that happened that historical scholars who aren't religious, some are believers, some are not,
right?
Are like, this existed and this happened.
But you're talking about historical scholars from 2,000 years ago. Right. And their knowledge of science and biology and life and the universe itself was extremely limited.
Right.
And so their entire fundamentals, like everything they believed in, was based on mythology. Everything was based on gods and demons and.
Okay, so then what about this? All right, fine. What if the Romans? Okay, they made it up, right? I'm sorry. The Romans are correct. The disciples took the body, who everyone agreed was dead. What about the 500 people that saw him in the town over the next 6 weeks?
Did you talk to those people?
No.
So who knows what they believed? But who knows what they actually believed? Who knows how they said it? Who knows if it was a religious thing? Look, there's people that have mass hallucinations all the time about a lot of things. And there's people that you could give them false memory. False memory is a real thing. Someone can convince you that something happened that didn't happen.
Right.
It's real. It's like they've demonstrated how to do it. We all know friends that have a memory of something, and you go, that's not what happened. And then you say your version of it, and then everybody has to like figure out what really happened. Right. You know, you're like, do you remember that time we were at the game and you said this? I didn't say that. Like, that was not me.
Yeah.
That was Mike.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're like, what? Yeah. You remember Mike lost his job?
Right.
And he was drunk. Do you remember? And they're like, oh, yeah. Like, you thought it was me. Like, you put it on me. It's like, you change things. Like, people change things.
Right.
They also, your memory becomes a memory of your memory and not the actual memory itself.
True.
It becomes a memory of the story you're telling.
Right.
And so if this person was this significant religious guru figure like Jesus was, right? And he really does have this amazing view of how humanity can live in harmony. And he really does talk to people about this. And he really does preach forgiveness. And he really does, like, treat everybody like they're the same, paupers and hookers and everyone's just God's children, loved. When that guy's gone, you're gonna miss him, man. You're gonna miss him bad. And if you really do have a fundamental view of reality that's based entirely on myth, and you have connected this guy to the Son of Christ, or the Son of God, rather, this figure that is brought here to save us, and the Romans took him from us and killed him, and now he died for our sins, and the whole thing.
Right.
If you have that in your head, and then someone says, "I saw him," like I saw him too.
Right.
Like people see the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich. People see things. Yeah. It doesn't mean those things aren't there. Right. It doesn't mean that isn't a vision, but it also does mean that people see things that aren't. And there's a lot of people that are not that bright. Yeah. They're not smart, and they're easily led, and they're easily manipulated. But it also doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't real. Right. Like all those things. But it's just the likelihood of someone coming back to life is very low. Right. The likelihood of someone taking his body is very high. Right. So if you used like Occam's razor, the simplest solution, the simplest answer is probably what you're searching for. It's probably that someone took the body.
Right.
I am actually really thankful for a guy like Joe. Like, I truly am. He is so willing to have any type of conversation about anything with anybody. And he's really insightful and asks good questions. I really wish more people had an inquisitive spirit like Joe, were willing to seek out truth wherever it led, and Chris here did a decent job of trying to defend his beliefs. Ironically though, a lot of the objections that Joe Rogan had are addressed in the book Chris was talking about. This book right here. Let's focus on the question here, because it's a really important question that Joe asks, but it's a flawed question. It's the wrong question. Joe asks if it's logical for a guy to rise from the dead. No, it's not. It's just not. A normal person wouldn't rise from the dead. So it's just stupid to even have that conversation. But that's the wrong question. The right question is this. Is it logical to assume that that man was actually God in human form? That's the proper question. Like I said, regular people just don't rise from the dead. But if anyone could rise from the dead, anyone at all, it would be God in human form. Of course, that assumes that God does exist. If you want some more information on that, go ahead and check out this video. But if God does exist, if there's actually a being out there who can manipulate and create space, time, and matter, it's fair to assume that if anyone could raise themselves from the dead, it would be that being. So let's ask the right question and try to answer it based only on evidence from after Jesus died. Is it logical to think that Jesus was God in human form? The first fact, women were the first people who the resurrected Christ revealed himself to. If the gospel writers were really wanting to lend credit to a lie, they would say that Christ revealed himself to men first. Probably Peter would be one of the first ones that they would mention. They would not say that women were the first people who saw Jesus and then went around telling everybody else. Women were not given a lot of credit in society in these days. Saying that would just discredit their account if it actually was a lie. As far as we can tell, the tomb was incredibly secure. The stone placed in front of the door would have taken several men to move it, and at this point in time with Jesus dead, it's far more likely to assume that his followers were scattered and in exile because their whole belief system was shattered. It seems really unlikely that after having seen Jesus die in person, having their whole worldview just completely devastated, that they would have been able to plan and execute stealing a body from an incredibly secure location. This leads into the next point. No historians really give credit to the idea that the body was stolen. Remember, this includes Christian and non-Christian historians. It's a theory that just doesn't hold much weight and doesn't circulate within professional circles. So it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that regular people should be trying to give credit to either. It's obvious that Jesus' followers actually believed he rose from the dead. People don't die for a lie. People do die for things that they believe in, and sometimes those things they believe in actually turn out to be false. That's true. But they don't die over a lie, and especially the kind of brutal deaths that the apostles went through. If they had stolen his body, they would be completely aware that they were lying about his resurrection. People don't die for things they don't believe in. We have it on pretty good authority from the accounts that we have that there were Roman guards stationed at the tomb. So Roman guards, trained warriors, or a ragtag group of disciples who had just had their whole worldview shattered by watching their leader die a brutal death. Who's gonna win that one? I'd probably give it to the Roman guards. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." When Paul says most of these people are still alive, he's basically saying, don't trust me, go ask them yourself. Joe, in that clip that we just watched, asked Chris if he had talked to those 500 people. Now, obviously not. I know Joe was exaggerating to prove a point. But here we have Paul in probably the very first thing that was written after the life of Jesus, basically saying, yeah, do go talk to those people. Most of those people are still around. Go ahead and check it out for yourself. That's about as confident of a testimony as we can ever expect to extrapolate from a writing from antiquity. It does not get better than that. Imagine if all historical authors wrote in their texts, ask people who are still alive to fact check me. The reason we don't ever really see that other than here in the Bible is because most historians are writing decades, hundreds, centuries of years after the person they're writing about actually died. But besides that point, Joe's logic when he asked that is pretty flawed. Just imagine if you overheard this conversation. Well, I overheard that the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. Did you talk to anybody who actually wrote it? Then how could you really know? Not to pick on Joe, but point being that his whole logic in that question was deeply flawed. The historical accounts of the amount of people who wrote that Jesus appeared to them or to others is overwhelming for a text that old. Mass hallucinations don't actually happen all the time, despite what Joe says here. In fact, they don't really happen at all. Hallucinations themselves are actually quite rare. And if by some crazy happenstance, mass hallucinations actually did happen in regards to what we're talking about here, the accounts would be highly individualized. There wouldn't be a wide agreement on them. There would be just an incredible amount of variance in the details from one person to the other. Because hallucinations, even though rare, when they do happen, are an individual thing. Dr. Gary Collins, a renowned psychologist, wrote this on mass hallucinations. Hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly aren't something that can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce an hallucination in somebody else. Now, groupthink can happen. Joe is right there. And people's memories can change, but that is a long process that happens over a very, very lengthy time. And again, it's more so an individual experience. We see incredibly early on from the Bible, possibly within months after Jesus' death, that his followers are actually writing down that they saw him and believe he rose from the dead. That includes doubting Thomas, who said he wouldn't believe it until he put his fingers where the nail marks were. It includes James, Jesus' brother, who did not believe his brother was the Messiah. And that includes Paul, whose job it was to kill Christians. Do you really think that it's likely that those two had their minds changed so much over time that they were completely willing to drop their prior beliefs and take on a belief system that got them brutally killed? And not to beat a dead horse here, but because we see within months written statements in Corinthians that people believed Jesus rose from the dead, that does not lend credit to the idea that their minds were changed slowly after time. This happened quick. Finally, there was a huge revolution to the practice of Jewish faith at the time in this area in the Middle East. Now, Judaism is one of the oldest religions we know of, and the people who adhere to the Jewish faith are pretty renowned for being extraordinarily strict and devout and devoted to their faith. Yet, more than at any time in history, we see a mass conversion of Jews to the Christian faith in this region at this time. Countless Jews at that time were converting to Christianity because they believed that Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. All of what we went through just there is only the evidence from after Jesus died. Never mind all the evidence that happened before the moment he was killed. Maybe one day Joe will pick up this book, and I hope he would, because it actually, more thoroughly than I have here, answers all the questions that he asked to Chris in that clip. I like Rogan, I really do. He's a guy who seems to be after the truth. It just happens that in this circumstance, he asked the wrong question. Dr. William Lane Craig probably says it the best. But the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead doesn't contradict science or any known facts of experience. All it requires is the hypothesis that God exists, and I think there are good independent reasons for believing that he does. So we've established that if anyone could rise from the dead, it would be God in human form. No other person could do that. So let me put this to you one more time, because this question is something you need to answer, not me. After looking at all the facts we just went through, is it more likely that this was just some regular dude or the Son of God? If you liked this video, you're gonna like that one.